Victor Navasky, author of Naming Names, Matter of Opinion, editor and publisher emeritus of The Nation magazine. Victor Navasky.
Thank you. It's great to be here. You know, we heard about how Studs was a great listener, and I think it was Charles Kuralt who said, when Stud listens, everybody talks. And but the truth is, that's only the half of it. I want to read you something that I wrote for The Nation about Studs, but in the course of it, to take liberties, as anyone who was on Studs' program would learn he would do, and so I'm going to do. So I remember the first time I met Studs, I'd written my first book. It was about Robert Kennedy's attorney generalship. My publisher sent me on a tour to Washington where I was on a program. I got up at 6 in the morning. I was on their morning news show. The guy said to me, "So tell me, Mr. Navasky, would you say the Kennedy brothers were the Rover Boys?" And I looked at him. I didn't, you know, I should have known what the Rover Boys were, but I said, "No, I wouldn't say that." And he said, "Thank you." And that was the whole interview. And then my publisher sent me to Chicago, and I arrived at WFMT in the studio that Studs had. And you get there, and he's got your book, and he's underlined it in yellow throughout the book. And he starts in, and he says, listen to this. He says, page 37. He reads page 37 in a way that reads all kinds of meanings you didn't know were in there that you said. He said, now, compare this to page 182. And he goes to 182, and he's got that in, and he says, how could you see on page 37 that he's going to have this on 182, and he's some brilliant new insight that he credits you with. And you leave there on a high. I can't begin to express what it was like. My friend Bud Trillin said to me before I went out there, he said, if the Guggenheim people knew what they were doing, instead of giving these $25,000 fellowships, they would give people an hour on the Studs Terkel show, and then they would really leave there as writers who understood what it was all about. And Studs could be funny too. In the late 1970s, he had a long history with The Nation magazine, which Katrina vanden Heuvel is going to tell you a little about, I think. But he was a reader, a writer, a cruiser with us, a promoter for the magazine. He served as master of ceremonies at Nation dinners. And I remember when I first got there was a dinner honoring his great friend, Carrie McWilliams, who was a famous, great editor of The Nation magazine. And I had gotten there at the same time young Hamilton Fish got there, and Ham was our publisher. And Ham was the grandson of the reactionary Congressman Hamilton Fish, who Roosevelt made famous as Martin, Barton, and Fish. And they were a very retrograde group. And Studs looked at Ham, and he couldn't let the occasion pass without commenting on Ham's reactionary grandfather. He said, it just goes to show the more things stay the same, the more they change. And Studs was a man not just of great taste, he was a man of tastes, and when we called him, he became a very modest $5,000 shareholder in The Nation when we got there. And this was before there was such a thing as a fax. And we had to get his signature by midnight at the end of the first of the year. And we called him and asked him if there was, we were going to send Ham's secretary, Shirley Sulat, out there, asked him if there was anything he needed, and he said, yeah, from New York, she's coming from New York, yeah. So she came and brought him what he needed, a pastrami sandwich on rye from the stage delicatessen. That's what he said he needed. I can't help it. Okay. You know, the late Lee Hayes, who was famous as one of the Weavers' folk singer, used to say that if it weren't for the honor of the thing, he'd just as soon not have been blacklisted. Well, Studs appreciated all of the honors that were heaped on him, including his Pulitzer Prize for the books that his great publisher, Andre Schifrin, published, and Andre gave him the ideas for his books. But I have to tell you something, he was proud of nothing more than being blacklisted from his own television show, Studs Place. He was kicked off the air from it early on. So he undoubtedly, he only, of all the people here, would have gotten a kick out of a story the New York Times ran a few days after his death. Here's the story the Times ran, and it was brought to my attention by James Hutrides, who used to produce CBS Sunday Morning, and it featured Studs on the show, along with John Leonard and others, a friend of Studs who alas died also. Here's a quote from the story by Edward Rothstein in the New York Times. On Monday, November 3rd, the Times wrote, in an appraisal of Mr. Terkel and his work, this is a quote from the Rothstein article, you would have thought that he was a secret terrorist or communist and the Cold War was still on. Look more closely, Rothstein wrote, and it becomes less clear where his liberalism slips into radicalism. Rothstein noted that Studs wore something wore something red. He had this red checkered shirt he wore something red every day to affirm his attachment to the working class. This is a quote from the New York Times a few days after Studs died. Think of that. You can imagine Studs Terkel riffing when he reads that. To be blacklisted when alive and red-baited after death, too good to be true. The ultimate comment, not so much on Studs, is on the culture he so valiantly resisted. On more than one occasion, Studs would compare a journalist to I.F. Stone, George Seldes, or Lincoln Steffens to indicate his highest accolade. Studs was more than a journalist, but his name now joins the ranks of those he admired. I want to just read you something he wrote about Carey McWilliams, who also he would cite. He reviewed his book in The Nation, and he said about Carey, because it's his language that I want to convey. He's saying, he's talking about this issue Carey guest edited for The Nation called How Free is Free, and it was in the 50s. McCarthyism was on. He says, the fat was really in the fire. The magazine was bitterly and constantly assaulted as the Kremlin's baby, especially by the new leader in commentary. Mr. McWilliams is devastating as he cites chapter and verse of the abominable role played by those Cold War lickspittles. Apparently, there is no sense of shame in those precincts. In the 1970s, they've picked up where they left off in the 1950s. Neoconservatives, how new is neo? Well, that's Studs. Lincoln Steffens, I.F. Stone, George Seldes, Carey McWilliams, all of the greats. He joins them and he adds on his own special zest. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Victor. Just by way of reflection, Studs Terkel was on the air in Chicago FMT from 1952 to 1997. That's the kind of no term limits I can get behind. Katrina vanden Heuvel, editor and publisher of The Nation magazine.
You're peachy, Studs would bellow through the phone. I loved it when Studs called me that. Who else would have? Whatever happened to that incomparable adjective, Studs would ask me. And he'd always tell me to pass that feeling on to, quote, your mother, who's probably too young to remember the adjective, though she deserves it too. My mother, by the way, considers herself a very minor disciple of Studs. She's tried her hand at oral history. Edie was one of her books. And one day she and Studs met up. She wanted to interview him, but the grand master of oral historians had come equipped, and he pulled out his taping equipment. After all, as Studs liked to say, I tape, therefore I am. And he'd add, only one other man has used the tape recorder with as much fervor as I, Richard Nixon. Well, in my mother, he met someone with about as much fervor for taping as Richard Nixon. So they sat for a while that afternoon like friendly cowboys in a high noon standoff. Two people so used to listening, getting stories out of people who didn't even know they had stories to tell. And I think after a bit, Studs decided, the hell with this. I'll just start talking. America's preeminent listener was, after all, a preeminent talker and a great interviewer. Interview he was. Studs, as Victor has said, had a great, long, wonderful relationship with The Nation as reader, writer, promoter. And one of my happiest moments as editor was when, with a measure of chutzpah and moxie, I called Studs to ask if he, at age 92, would write a tribute to his friend Pete Seeger, who was about to turn 86. And he happily agreed. You see, I had seen Pete and Studs together just a couple years earlier at FDR's stomping grounds, Hyde Park. Studs loved FDR and the New Deal way before it got fashionable. He loved how it gave dignity, hope, and work to ordinary people. After all, Studs worked for the WPA's Federal Writers Project. He was a child of the Depression, and he wrote about when he learned FDR died, he leaned on a lamppost and wept. So Studs was at Hyde Park that November to get a Four Freedoms Medal. And while his award was for freedom of speech, he could have qualified for any one of those four freedoms. So Studs regaled the crowd that afternoon. There were mucky mucks. There was Senator Robert Byrd, the one guy Studs liked to say, who said bugger off when Bush came around to try to sell that idea of the war. And Studs regaled everyone with tales of imagining arriving at Hyde Park and asking FDR, "Mr. President, could you fix me one of your superb martinis?" And he took special delight in being there that November day in 2003 because it just happened to coincide with the dedication of the Henry Wallace Visitor Center, spitting distance from the FDR Library. So Studs reminisced about working for and voting for Henry Wallace. So fast forward, 2 years later, Studs writes a tribute to Pete Seeger. And let me quote just briefly from his wonderful piece, because it's as much about Studs as it is about Pete. This is Studs. "It's hard to think of Pete Seeger as an elderly gaffer, because the boy in him, the light, remains undimmed. The night when I first encountered the four wandering minstrels of the Almanac Singers was a cold Chicago beauty. At 2 in the morning, my wife heard the doorbell ring. I was away rehearsing the first play in which I'd ever appeared. It was Waiting for Lefty, of course. And there at the door were the four of them. The first was a bantam, freckled, red-haired, and elfin. He handed my wife a note saying, 'These are good fellows. Put them up for the night.' Now, putting them up was a rough assignment. Even for a Depression-era social worker, what with the only spare bunk being a Murphy bed that sprang from the walls. Freckles announced himself as Woody Guthrie. The second was an Ozark Mountain man named Lee Hayes. The third was a writer, Millard Lampell. The fourth, somewhat diffident, more in the background, was a slim jaw of 20 or so fretting around with his banjo. He was Pete Seeger." And Studs closed, "Hail Pete, at 86, still the boy with that touch of hope in the midst of bleakness." That is Studs, a touch of hope in the midst of bleakness, a hope monger. And for someone who lived through so many isms, if he had an ism, as his good Chicago friend Gary Wills, I think, said, his was underdogism. And all the while, with tape recorder in one hand, martini in another, Studs stood for the radical idea of the long memory. How could he not? Vigilant optimist that he was, for a man who was born the year the great black boxer Jack Johnson was denied passage on the Titanic, and who lived to see an African American from his beloved Chicago on the verge of the presidency. Last time I spoke to Studs, it was in July, and it was to ask if he'd sign the nation's open letter to Obama, holding the candidate to his promises and possibilities. "Sure," Studs said, "sign me up." "But he needs to counterpunch," Studs bellowed. "Remember his roots as a community organizer." And Studs especially wanted to make sure that Obama was moved, was pushed to launch a New Deal, how he would have celebrated those workers in the sit-down strike in Chicago yesterday. So as Studs said of Pete Seeger, I say of Studs, there ain't no one like him. Love the man. He was peachy.
I did about that tape recorder, Katrina. I did once ask Studs how did he sort of avoid the problem of people being intimidated by the tape recorder, and he said, "I would hit it a little, just to put it down and in its place." Gary Young is a columnist for The Guardian in the UK and a regular contributor to The Nation magazine. He's also the author of 2 great books, No Place Like Home and Stranger in a Strange Land, Encounters in the Disunited States.
Thanks very much. Back during the early 80s, Studs was standing at the number 146 bus stop in Chicago when 2 with two yuppies, and two yuppies who he had seen several times, but who had failed to notice him. And Studs was an institution in Chicago. Everybody knew who he was, and he said, when I interviewed him, this was for The Guardian, he said, "It hurts my ego," he said, "but this morning the bus was late and I thought this was my chance." And now the rest I'm going to read in his voice, his account of dealing with these two yuppies. He said to the man who was all decked out in Brooks Brothers and Gucci shoes, and he said, "Labor Day's coming." And then Studs said, "Well, that was the wrong thing to say," as though he didn't know already. And he said, "So the man looks towards me with such a look of contempt. It's like now Coward has just spotted a bug on his collar." And he says, "We despise unions." And I thought, ooh. "So the bus was still late," said Studs, "and I've got a winner here. And suddenly I'm the ancient mariner, and I fix him with my glittering eye. 'How many hours a week do you work?' I asked. And the man said, 8. And I said, 'How comes you don't work 18 hours a day like your great-grandfather did?' 'You know why? Because 4 guys got hung in Chicago in 1886, fighting for the 8-hour day. For you.' Well, he was scared," said Tubbs. "And the bus was still late. And I've got this guy pinned up against the mailbox, and he just couldn't get away. 'How many days a week do you work?' I went on. Well, the bus did eventually came, and I never saw them again. But I think that every workday morning, his wife was looking at me from the 15th floor of their flashy apartment block to see if the madman was still there." Now, Studs told a fantastic story, and while we all, and I will too, give testament to his listening, he also could talk the legs off a hind donkey too. That story took actually 25 minutes to tell, because Studs would veer off into, some story from 1920 or 1930, and I'm a bit like Laura, trying to kind of keep some focus here because it's an interview for a paper, and I'd say, "So about, the bus stop," and he'd go, I'm coming to that, don't worry about that. So it's like jazz improv talking to Studs. So he loved to listen, and in a way, listening was his vocation, and he liked to talk. And actually, those two things became increasingly problematic as he got older, because he's a man who liked to listen and who became quite deaf. So actually, when he would talk, he would shout quite a bit. But as soon as I arrived, and I was, no one to him, to interview him, he came out from a back room in his apartment, and immediately he wanted to talk to me about an article I'd just written for The Nation about Obama. Then he wanted to talk to me about Tony Blair and why was he holding Bush's coat. Then he wanted to talk to me about Ken Livingstone and his chances in the mayoral elections in London. An incredibly curious and lively man. This was last January. It was 95. And around his apartment, the first thing he did actually, after talking to me about my Nation article, was offer me a whiskey, which I thought was incredibly generous. And around him there was books on Einstein, Orson Welles, Katrina Hepburn, and a host of others. And you can tell that this guy's mind was racing like his stories were racing. He was, in the very best way, all over the place, just kind of like a magpie, just picking things up and then, meshing them together in his own unique way. And the stories that he told, you were never quite sure. He would tell the story about Mahalia Jackson and the blacklisting story and how they said, are you for communism? And he said, if the communists were against cancer, would I have to be for cancer? Is that what it's come to? And he would tell a story with Mahalia Jackson, and the next moment he would be telling a story about One-Armed Charlie, who was a guy with no teeth, and apparently one arm, who ate graveyard stew. And I asked him what graveyard stew is, and he said it was a thing that you ate where you dip you dip bread in milk to make it mushy if you had no teeth. And he was talking about One-Armed Charlie, and the Seattle strike of 1919. And he would keep throwing out these references. And of course, I'm both, well, there was the thing about keeping him focused, but there's also an issue of vanity, not least because he had said, you know, people don't know anything, they can't remember anything. So I would just nod as though I knew what the strike of 1919 was, and then, you know, as soon as I got back to my hotel, you know, straight onto Wikipedia and everywhere else, trying to find out what he was talking about. And that was another thing that was great about him, was that he assumed you should know this stuff. And if you don't know, then find out, because it's part of your history, and it's part of our story. Now, I work for the Guardian and the Nation, and while I was interning at the Guardian, we were sent off. The Guardian has a program for young non-white journalists, and I was on this program, and we were sent off to these very, very small towns in the north of England where there are very few black people and none in the newsrooms. And there were 3 of us in these small towns having these kind of terrible experiences. And one of my friends, whose name was Randeep, an Indian guy, had called me while I was out doing some court reporting, and I came back, and you could tell that the copy editors had been waiting for this moment. And I came back and they said, "You've had a phone call, Gary, son." And I said, "Okay." And he said, "They say here, Gary, Randy at work. But we don't know whether that's a message or a description." And they fell about laughing. And 2 days later, I went out with my 2 colleagues, Randeep and Ken Saro-Wiwa, son of the late Nigerian environmentalist and playwright. And Ken Saro, this isn't a sophisticated comment, and there'll be many people who might be offended by this in the audience, but actually it was pertinent to our experience at that time. We were eating in this Chinese restaurant, and Ken Saro-Wiwa said to me, well, to both of us, he said, "What is it about white guys that they get to a certain age and they just feel the need to be so fucking boring?" And it really did speak to what we were going through. And the point here is that the more powerful you get, the less you have to listen. The more we can all come up and talk, and the more status you have. And that was what was great about Studs. And with Obama in, people keep talking about, well, this is going to be a fantastic role model for young black men, and that may well be true. I hope it is true. But they talk about it as though people are limited to looking at role models as people who look like them, and that some young white kid might not find Obama as a role model, or that I might not find Studs as a role model. And I really do, as a 30-something journalist, to meet and read and know about a man who has a voice and yet is interested in other people's voices, who is generous with his time, who has maintained both a spirit of battle and a sense of humor, who told these fantastic stories and somehow managed not to get in the way of them, who was a voice for the voiceless. That, for me, is a real role model of something I might be in my life. If come 60 I can listen half as much as he did, and learn half as much as he did, and be half as curious as he was, then I will feel like my life has been well served. So I'm going to finish with a quote from E.M. Forster, because it really speaks to me, to what Studs was about. He says, "I believe in an aristocracy of the sensitive, the considerate, and the plucky. Its members are to be found in all nations and classes and all through the ages, and there is a secret understanding when they meet. They represent the true human tradition, the one permanent victory over cruelty and chaos." To me, Studs was that victory, and he was that popular aristocrat, the one way in which one might speak of that without being a contradiction. And he represented the very finest in human tradition. Thank you.
Gary Young. Next up, a man who is curious and who has enabled many important stories to be told, longtime publisher of Studs Terkel, Andrei Schifrin, director and editor-in-chief at the New Press.
Thank you, and thank you all for coming here. Studs would have been really delighted to know that you were here, that we had this occasion. He had planned himself a memorial which will take place in Chicago at the end of January, and he planned it very carefully. But it was for the people in the Midwest, Garrison Keillor, George Willis, and others, who were old friends and admirers. And he did not know that we were going to have this tonight. And I'm delighted that we have, and I think he would have been very pleased. There are many other people who wanted to come and talk, and there are people throughout the world who were very eager to speak up about Studs today. The Observer in London today has a column by one of their columnists who says that reading Studs' Division Street had really had an incredible impact on his life. It had changed the way he'd seen America. It had created an America that he wanted to see. And I think that's something that we need to remember, that for many people overseas, Studs was the voice of America in a way that our government was never able to do. And he showed a population in its diversity and its reality that the official historians, and certainly the official propagandists, had no interest in discovering. I've worked with Studs for over 40 years. There are people here like Dan Terkel, who, of course, who will speak next, who have known Studs all of their life. Some people here have met him only recently. But I think all of us had very much the same feelings about him. And for me, during those 40 years and the 14 books we worked on together, the major feeling was one of astonishment. He always surprised me from the very beginning to the very end. As Victor has said, when I first met him, he had just been interviewing an author, and I saw him underlining every other page of the book that he had just read. And I understood later why someone like Harrison Salisbury would say that he was much more interesting on Studs' book, on Studs' program, than he had ever been in any of his books. Studs was able to get the best out of people, and he did so with an extraordinary range. He was a remarkable musicologist. If you've ever read his book, And They All Sang, you'll see how he can compare Mahalia Jackson with an aria from Mozart or with the music of Ravi Shankar in a way that many musicologists would be very proud to discover. He was, with all of the folksiness and the camaraderie that has been described, he was a remarkable intellectual. He understood the country, he understood its past, he understood its culture in a way that very few people I've met have ever been able to do. After his programs, which is how I heard about him, I asked him to do Division Street, to try and do a book about ordinary people. And he was very amused that a New Yorker should come to Chicago and suggest that he do a book about a village, because I had just published Jan Myrdal's report from a Chinese village, and I thought it would be interesting to have an American equivalent, that is, to see through the eyes of ordinary folk how their lives had changed in the previous decades. And so Studs did this so brilliantly and so interestingly that it was clear that he was really going to be our historian, that he would write a history of America from the 1920s to the present, coming up with the stories that many of you have read, and also with many of the secrets that people had often kept from themselves. I used to say that Studs could get people to speak openly and frankly, even when they had lied to themselves. And one of the things he was proudest of was some woman in a Chicago housing project who at the end of their interview said, "My God, I didn't know I felt that way." And he was able to bring people out of themselves in that fashion. Even people who certainly he didn't agree with, and the idea that was tried by Rothstein to say he was just a propagandist looking for folks who would reinforce his views couldn't have been wronger. He interviewed the man who dropped the bomb on Hiroshima. He was proudest of one of his interviews with a man who had been in the KKK and had finally changed his way of life when he realized how the KKK was being used by the people in the South who wanted to keep whites and blacks separated from each other. So he was able to go to people who he didn't agree with in the slightest, but who he respected. And when young interviewers ask me what was his secret, I say, that you can read it in the text, actually. It is his extraordinary respect for the people to whom he spoke. He wasn't looking for a soundbite. He wasn't looking for a quick fix. He wanted to really know how they felt, even if they didn't know themselves. It's interesting, Victor has talked about this unpleasant Rothstein article in the Times, and he was able to make light of it in a way that I wouldn't quite, because I think it's such a sad comment on our society that the McCarthyism that so really ruined his life as a performer. He was thrown into the wilderness by the McCarthy period, by his courage and refusing to knuckle under, that it should have surfaced again 2 days after his death. And the Rothstein article, which said in effect that Studs was trying to impose on ordinary people his Marxist view of alienation and so on, was actually very interesting, because it made me realize what was at the bottom of a lot of this McCarthyite thinking. It was a kind of denial of reality. Just as the McCarthyites in the 50s couldn't admit that countries like China wanted to go to the communists, so Rothstein could not accept the idea that we were not a country of happy working men, the myth that the right has always believed in, and that their unhappinesses were brought in by outside agitators, and therefore it was the messenger who had to be punished, as he tried to do, I think, not very effectively with Studs. But Studs was the opposite of denial. He was someone who wanted to affirm, and who did so extremely well. He stayed with me through 14 books, including the years when we left Random House over basic differences as to what publishing was about. He refused many offers of vast amounts of money to go elsewhere and stayed with the New Press, which we then started, and is responsible in many ways for our having survived these many years, and really had a very good period of time thanks to his book in great part. So I have a real debt to him for that loyalty. But as a country, I think we have a broader debt to him as someone who has taught us how to really understand what the country is like, to look at our past, to admit to all the failings that others have tried to cover up, and to understand what America was about. Thank you.
I just want to, how are we doing celebrating Studs? Are we still in celebratory mood? Do you have a little bit of celebration left over? Because I would like to just take a moment to celebrate the New Press and Andre Schifrin for the incredible work that they do. Next up, we have the self-professed policy wonk and project planner, also Studs' son, Dan Terkel. Thanks for coming, joining us at the podium. Studs, Dan Terkel.
Greetings from Chicago, folks. Glad to see you here. Like my father, I'm an agnostic, or in his own words, a cowardly atheist. So I try to keep an open mind. I don't know if there's a heaven or a hell or an afterlife, but I'd like to believe that once the physical being makes that grand exit from the planet, that the spirit will live on and maintain a presence among us. If indeed my dad's spirit is present in this hall, he'll have come full circle, a virtual round trip between New York and Chicago, with numerous side junkets in between. 96 and a fraction years ago, he entered this world just a short spit up the road from here, 213 Avenue A, corner of 13th Street. The building's still there. He was the youngest of three brothers, the baby of the family. His father, Sam, was a mild-mannered tailor, loved and renowned for his gentleness. His mother, Annie, despite her tiny stature, was a woman of towering presence, who viewed the world through pince-nez glasses with a perpetual cynical squint. Whenever she spoke, and Yiddish was her first language, she tended to add more than a dash of color to an already colorful tongue. Even her English was known to be volatile. His eldest brother, Meyer, was a scholar who encouraged my father to read and ask questions. Benny, the middle brother, was a bon vivant, a ladies' man who introduced my father to the earthier aspects of life. So there you have it, a quick synopsis of the early years of Louis Terkel, pre-Studs. Fast forward a bit. A well-to-do cousin encouraged the family to resettle in Chicago in 1921 when my father was 9. Annie and Sam managed a rooming house for the first few years. Then, in the late 20s, they held forth at a men's hotel on the fringe of downtown Chicago. Among the hotel residents were craftsmen, railroad hands, dishwashers, and retirees, many of whom were self-educated. They were Wobblies, other socialists, and also company men, otherwise known as capitalists with holes in their pockets. When they'd congregate in the lobby on Sundays, vigorous debates would ensue, often fueled by liquid lubricants. These were folks who inspired my father to become an activist. They were his earliest mentors, along with Eugene Debs, Clarence Darrow, Albert and Lucy Parsons, and of course, his father Sam and his brothers Meyer and Benny. Then there was law school. Having had visions of Clarence Darrow, instead he found himself face to face with contracts and torts. It wasn't his bag. He somehow, though, managed to graduate, but never had the desire to practice. During the Depression, he managed to find civil service work, but also became involved with the Chicago Repertory Group, a group of performers who were kindred spirits. They believed in community theater, often appearing at union rallies in behalf of various humane causes. Apparently, a number of cast members shared my father's given name, Louis. The director noticed that he was showing up for rehearsals carrying a thick book under his arm, James T. Farrell's Studs Lanigan trilogy. So one day he said to my dad, "Hey, Studs, come here." The name stuck. So there you have it, his formative years. So now I'd like to focus on the one watershed event that really set the course for the rest of my father's life, the blacklist. Joe McCarthy bestowed upon my father a wonderful gift, as perverse as that may sound. Had Tail Gunner Joe and his minions not launched their merciless crusade, chances are that my dad would have been a very different Studs Terkel. Chances are he'd have never become the free-spirited messenger of goodwill, holding forth on Chicago's WFMT radio for 45 years. Chances are he'd have never hooked up with Andre Schifrin, who, with his relentless coaxing and cajoling, encouraged my father to help create, along with the legions of the folks in his books, a massive body of work for the ages. My dad would never, ever consider compromising his humane values. That's what led to the untimely end of his budding TV career. In the embryonic days of network TV, there was this weekly show out of Chicago known as Stud's Place, featuring a colorful array of characters and set in a modest neighborhood diner. The dialogue was improvised and the show had wide appeal. One fateful day in 1951, a PR man from the network showed up at the studio. He had with him a thick stack of petitions my father had signed in support of various progressive causes. such as the Anti-Fascist League and various civil rights groups. The PR guy wasn't happy. "We're in trouble because of you. Don't you know that communists are behind these petitions?" Without missing a beat, my dad responded with another question. "If the communists came out against cancer, would we automatically be for cancer?" The fellow was not amused. So much for Studs Place. But nevertheless, my father loved to boast that he never met a petition that he didn't like. On the other hand, my mother Ida, a woman of equally strong convictions with an eternally graceful presence, never met a demonstration she didn't like. A number of years ago, they retrieved their respective dossiers from the FBI. As it turned out, my mother's file was much thicker. I don't think my dad ever quite got over that. So, our family did have some lean years throughout the 50s and 60s. My father had become an enduring presence at WFMT, but the station still had a very limited audience, so nobody got rich. However, he loved what he was doing. By the mid-60s, the station had established a magazine called Perspective, which sometimes featured written transcripts of my father's interviews. They ultimately caught the eye of Andre Schifrin. The rest is history. As a conversationalist, my dad had an uncommon knack for making everyone feel at ease. So, as an oral historian, he didn't really ever conduct interviews in the strictest sense. Instead, they were conversations, revelatory conversations. Sure, he'd ask questions all right, but there was nothing formulaic about them. The conversation was always a continuous, spontaneous flow. He'd get folks involved by revealing his own frailties, especially his mechanical aptitude, which was legendary. Whenever he'd struggle with his tape recorder, they'd lend a helping hand. That made them feel needed. On one such occasion, my father was interviewing a single mother with young kids. Once the conversation was finished, he played back the tape so the woman could hear it. She sat absolutely transfixed. So did her kids. When it was over, she declared, "I never knew I felt that way." In 1999, my mother Ida, his wife of 60 years, passed away. They had shared the same passions, the same sense of social justice. It was a delightful, often exhilarating life they had together, although sometimes tempestuous. To quote Sean O'Casey, it was like a lament in one ear, but always a song in the other. Thereafter, my father and I drew closer together. Sure, we had our issues, as do many fathers and sons. That's something to do with our fragile male egos, I guess. He needed me, and I guess in my fashion, despite my own active life, I needed him too. Like I said at the beginning, I honestly don't know whether there's a heaven or hell, but just in case, I would bet that Tail Gunner Joe and my father are not in the same place. So, here's to you, Pop. Take it easy, but take it.
Thank you, Dan. Next up, we have Sydney Lewis, who worked with Studs Terkel for many years. She describes herself as having worked as a waitress, an administrative assistant, a bookkeeper, etc. One of her earliest real jobs was in the program department at WFMT, where she says she was brought into close daily contact with Studs. She has yet to recover.
I was just very, very lucky to get to work with him. He was, well, the first time I met him, I was waitressing. I was waitressing at a Chicago club, the Quiet Night, and they were having a benefit for the Wobblies, and he and Ida were in my section. So I went to get his drink, and I had read Working. I had loved Working, but I went to get his drink order, and where are you from? How long have you been here? Do you know what the Wobblies are? Do you know who they are? And he went on and on and on, and finally I said, I read Working and I loved Working, but I am working. What do you want to drink? And that was sort of the rapport we had. He cackled. So eventually I ended up working at WFMT Radio, and when people would ask me what I did for him, I would say, nanny, because he kind of had the energy of a 3-year-old, a hyperactive 3-year-old. And he didn't like talking. He loved talking. And the only time he wasn't talking was when he was interviewing. He would leave his house in the morning with his little blue jacket and Hush Puppies. He was heartbroken when Hush Puppies were unavailable. And he always had books, rubber bands, on newspapers, and he'd get on the bus and make friends all over the city from riding the bus, and then he'd walk to work. Sometimes I would be late, and I'd walk behind him, and he would be just talking, narrating. Life was to be narrated. The story trumped everything, and he was exhausting. People say, the gag about the cowardly atheist, and he would call it a gag, but he did understand some religion. First there was the Word, always the Word, and also Buddhists talk about in the moment. He was totally in the moment. Part of why his interviews were so remarkable was because he was so fully present with his attention, really embracing you with his attention. But he was also in another moment, in a historical moment, and he was thinking about something next. So you always felt like you were having, he was having 3 conversations and you were part of one of them, and if you could keep up with the whole thing, you were doing pretty good. So he'd get to work, and you would always know he was coming because first was the voice. The elevator doors would open, and you would hear the voice that Tom Englehart made me laugh. We were commiserating after Studs died, and Tom said it's the only voice he ever heard that has a cigar coming out of it. And then he'd be coming down the hallway, and he'd come around the corner. He'd either say, "Hey, kid, good morning, how you doing?" Or, "What do you hear, what do you say?" That's from a Jimmy Cagney movie. He must have said that to me 700 times. But you just, he was very, very, very playful. And the day was always, he might have a steel worker or a social worker. He might have some celebrated historian, a musician. It might be a little conflict about, because he was listed on the masthead as a free spirit. And a free spirit working in a structure sometimes has conflicts. So that's where the nanny would come in. So he might have discovered some great Greek bouzouki players who were coming, and he had to tape them right now, and it didn't matter if the Chicago Symphony Orchestra's quartet was already booked in the studio, and sometimes he would have little frustrated fits, or where was that record that he had to have because he was going to read a story by Alice Munro with Beggar Maid, and he had to have this one particular record. Where was it? And so everyone would drop everything and try to help him find it, and usually it was in his office. But his office was just amazing. It was everyone sent manuscripts for him to blurb. People sent books. They wanted to be interviewed. People sent records. You could lose bodies in that office. And once Oliver Sacks came, they had an opera date. They were going to go to the opera together. And he was waiting while Studs finished an interview. And he came out to my desk and he said, I put my favorite pen down. I've lost it. Studs could find things, but nobody else could. It was sort of like he was sort of like one circus in a human body, and he was the ringmaster and the trapeze artist and the lion tamer and the rogue elephant and everything. He was just remarkable to be around. His energy was so powerful. I remember bringing Ida to visit him when he'd had a quintuple bypass at 84, which he was quite proud. And he was in intensive care, okay? So there's 4 beds, 3 occupied, 2 people flat out. And this is the morning after, and he's sitting up, wolfing some soup down. He goes, "Hey, would you like some soup? Would you like some soup?" Because he was always ever generous. And then he was looking at a blank monitor. He's like, you know, there's a ball game on. Can we get that on that screen up there? I leaned over just to tease him and yelled into his ear, I said, how are you? Do you know who the president is? And he looked up at me and he said, McKinley? So, you know, he was like a musician, like a jazz musician in the way he went about living. There was always room for the unexpected, and it was the real luck of my life to have been a graduate of the School of Studs. He helped me make sense of the world. I don't know how I will make sense of it without him. He was really inept. Technically, I know it was a bit of a shtick, but it was true. And also, it was a good thing in some ways because, for example, he couldn't figure out how to work the postage meter. And every once in a while, he'd get riled about something, and you'd hear him muttering, and there'd be the and you know. And sometimes those letters escaped into the world, and always the next day there would be a ruin regret. So when I learned that, I would intercept and say, I'll mail it, don't worry. And then the next day, did you mail that letter? I'd say, oh, no, I forgot. Well, maybe that's just as well. I got to listen to all these radio shows, people in Chicago who were lucky enough to hear that program. There were people who set their lives by that program at 10 o'clock, which it was on for years. And the letters he would get from people, people felt that he belonged to them. And everyone who was ever interviewed by him felt that they had a very special connection with him. More special than anyone else's connection, most likely. He could come to your home and interview you and make you feel more at home in your home than you had ever felt. He had a way. It was his real gift. I just listened the other day to a BBC tribute by an oral historian, really nice, and there was Studs talking in it, and I'll just read something that he said. Most of my life, I've been listening to these voices and trying to record as many as I possibly can. And I find that all of them at one time or another have astonished me, have surprised me. And I realize, too, there's no such thing as a stereotype. Each one is different. Now, they come from a certain society, and that very society may have influenced their lives and the way they think. But each one individually is unique, and that's the aspect I consider somewhat sacred. One of the people that he considered somewhat sacred was Peggy Terry, who was Appalachian and grew up during the Depression, and he would often tell the story about her where she, as she said, she learned to cuss. Her parents would take her to send the kids to the soup line with their buckets, and the guy would just skim off the top, so they would just get this broth, and she'd ask him please to dip down, and he wouldn't, so she would get there and she'd say, dip down, God damn it, so she could get some meat and potatoes. And Peggy was in several of his books. Her father was in the Klan for a while. She grew up in a very racist environment and came to Chicago and learned that it was just about who had and who didn't. And when Eldridge Cleaver ran for president, she was his vice president candidate. Studs interviewed her for Hard Times, and here's a little something she said that has certain resonance today. I think that's the worst thing that our system does to people, is to take away their pride. It prevents them from being a human being. I don't think people were put on earth to suffer. I think that's a lot of nonsense. I don't think it's right for a handful of people to get a hold of all the things that make living a joy instead of a sorrow. You wake up in the morning and it consciously hits you. It's just like a big hand that takes your heart and squeezes it, because you don't know what that day is going to bring, hunger or you don't know. And then he went back to her. Dan and I were with him to interview her for Will the Circle Be Unbroken, which was the book he worked on after Ida died, which was really hard. He asked me to speak at her memorial. As you can tell, I'm not used to speaking publicly, and I was very anxious. I said, well, what do you, was there something you want me to talk about? And he said, about 3 minutes. So anyway, here's Peggy many years later, dying of emphysema, sort of trapped in her house. She said, I think one reason people are so desperate about dying is they haven't lived yet. All we do here is we try to see who can get a little higher up the ladder than the neighbor. I think life is so miserable for most people all the time. They're racing around like mad, drunken ants. They're fearing dying. Studs was not fearing dying. He was really quite ready to go in most respects. And I spent a lot of time talking to him over the last few years. I'd moved out of Chicago, but I'd come back, and even recovering from a broken neck and 2 months in the hospital, he would still exhaust me. He one time talked for 5 hours. I'm not kidding. So I said to him, I was talking about his dying, and I said, how do you want to be remembered? Because that was a question he asked everybody in Will the Circle Be Unbroken, and he did the gag, cowardly atheist. Curiosity does not kill this cat. And then I said, well, not the gag, really. And he paused, and he said, I think curiosity. He said, the key word is why. And I asked him if he was afraid at all, and he said, I kind of, for a moment, Jesus, what's going to happen? There's ego involved here, too. Will I be missed? Who will miss me, and for how long? And he laughed, because I went, and immediately started crying. Sorry. He said, that's the other thing, that's a question. So the books, there's something, but even so, will people talk about you? There's a fear, of course, fear of the unknown. I envy those who believe because they feel they will meet their dear ones. Well, you can't beat that. Nobody's going to win the bet. Who are they going to pay the bet to? That's the one thing you can't bet on. You can bet on citation, on Seabiscuit, but you can't bet on a hereafter. I use the speech, what you do now is the hereafter. This moment, what you do, if it does mean anything, does live after you. It'll be nice, good for your not alter ego, but after ego to be remembered. I think people want to be remembered for something. That's our friend Mike Lavelle, who's a steel worker, who said, who'll know I ever lived? I pound my hammer into an ingot of iron, bam, to make a bump in it, my bump. And I said, what would you want your biggest bump to be? And he said, oh, I don't know. When people write these certain letters about how their life has been influenced, that I reached somebody, I like bumps like that. You all are a nice bump.
Next up, we're very, very honored to have with us Stetson Kennedy, one of this country's pioneering folklorists, the author of many books, including the Jim Crow Guide and the Klan Unmasked. He's the co-author of South Florida Folk Life. Stetson Kennedy, welcome to the microphone.
Well, like they used to say down south where I come from, I'm just so proud to be here. Someone handed me 2 pages just before it came out from backstage, listing other people who have spoken here in this Cooper's Union, starting with the name of John Brown. And I said to myself, this fight for freedom and social justice and world peace had no beginning, and it's going to have no end. So I think it's altogether fitting that we gather here today and celebrate the life and the work and the legacy of Studs Terkel. Studs and I had a great deal in common, including the WPA and the Writers Project and the Depression. And I was in Florida and he was in Chicago, and I was supposed to be the boss of Zora Hurston on the Florida Project. And he was up in Chicago with Richard Wright and a lot of other wonderful people. And we just sort of kept an eye on what they were doing by long distance. There wasn't that much direct contact, but we were very much aware of what the other was up to. And we were very much into collecting oral histories and ex-slave narratives in Florida. And these, of course, we called them life histories in those days. We hadn't invented the word oral history. But this was the beginning, and I've spent a great deal of my life, going from life history to oral history, just in the same manner that Studs did, and I was highly honored that he included me in one of his books. want to put in a good word for oral history in terms of its veracity, because it's something that comes not from someone poking around the stacks, but from the people who make history and do the history and do the fighting and dying and the work. And they are not only participants in many cases, but if they're not participants, they're eyewitnesses. So they bring to bear all of their sensory organs onto the scene. So for that reason, I can't help but feel that oral history is here to stay. And one of my books, speaking of true history, I was going around before Howard Zinn, an esteemed colleague here on stage, did his book on people's history of the United States. I was going around saying that anyone who's brave enough to write a true history of the United States had better have 1 foot over the water. And so my compliments are hats off to him. One of my books, Jim Crow Guide, was I couldn't find a publisher in the United States, and I ended up with John Paul Sartre in Paris publishing it for the first time. And no sooner published it than some yuppie CIA agent came to me with waving it in my face and saying, "This thing hurts like hell," and said, "If you would just repudiate it and say it's a put-up job, we'll make you financially independent for life." And I said, "Well, if you can just point to anything in it that's inaccurate, I'd be happy to collect it for free." And he couldn't point to anything. And I called a press conference exposing the attempted bribe. So I lived hand to mouth ever since. You know, while I was wandering around overseas, 8 years studying what other peoples were doing and not doing, from time to time I would hear someone say, you know, the Americans are the most politically illiterate people among all the industrial nations on earth. And of course that hurt, and I didn't quite know what to say. But I'm very happy to be able to say here tonight that after the recent election, they can't say things like that anymore. You know, at long last, we've got a president we can call our own. Studs, my wife and I went up to Studs' 95th birthday, and he said, among other things, that he thought perhaps he had lived too long. But I'm certain that when he saw the outpouring and the coming together that attended the Barack Obama rallies, that he was very glad, as I am, to have lived so long, because you know, nothing like it ever was, and it's I hope just the beginning. He didn't live to see the inaugural, but I have a feeling that Studs just may well be there. We may not see him, but he'll be there with bells on. The inaugural, in my opinion, there's nothing like it in American history or human history has ever been like this inaugural is going to be. So I know that we're all looking forward to it. What the outpouring and the coming together meant to me was that my life and Stud's life and the life of there are thousands of other Americans who spent their time working for such a coming together, you know, was not in vain. Back in 1947, some lady in one of my audiences said she had been handing out pamphlets all her life and going to meetings and signing petitions and writing letters. She said in 47, was it all in vain? Well, I didn't know what to say to her in 47. But in 2008, she got her answer. It was not in vain. The solidarity which we saw on Election Day, we've seen in recent history what the very concept of solidarity and the word and the reality, the manner in which it was able to change the course of history in Europe. And I think that the United States of America today, we're standing in need of that same kind of solidarity. It's just the beginning. We hear a lot of talk in our time about trickle-down, and in my opinion, the meltdown is going to be one sure thing for a trickle-down. It's just begun. I hate to think, and I hope I'm wrong, but I'm obliged to think that it's going to be not just trickle down, but it's going to come upon us like a tsunami. And the only thing that we can save ourselves is by this word solidarity. Studs was there in the first Depression, as I was. And someone was asking me recently what it was like, and I didn't know of a short answer, so I said, well, it had to do with the blue plate. And of course, they didn't know what I was talking about, and I had to explain that back then the blue plate consisted, it was a vegetable plate. You got 4 vegetables and a biscuit or cornbread and a drink for 5 cents. And very much of America was living on blue plates. And you may have noticed on television recently they've been inviting people to buy McDonald's stock. Signs of the times. Studs' books attest the fact that, the manner in which Americans back then, by fortitude and suffering, and a whole lot of it, you remember Carl Sandburg's line about where the shapes of hunger wander and the fugitives from pain go by. And coming back here to Manhattan after a half-century absence, I was impressed by the fact that so far in just so many hours I haven't seen so many shapes of hunger wandering and the fugitives of pain going by. I know, of course, they're out there. But if this thing develops, as I'm afraid it will, we're going to see an awful lot of it. And people back then were prepared. They were a lot closer to the earth. They hadn't been living in the lap of luxury. This middle class and the working class, the standard of living has been such that we're not very well prepared for what may be in store for us. And we may find ourselves having to go to the old-timers and get some helpful hints. I hate to stand here and sound like an alarmist of any sort, but at the same time, I can't help but feel that, there are times for alarm, like in the day of Paul Revere. And in this present moment of 2008, it's my impression that no less of a crisis and an emergency than if we were an occupied country, occupied by a foreign power who has strewn minefields from coast to coast, biological and chemical minefields, and we're just running on, the gas tank is quite possibly empty, and we're running on the vapor. To change the subject, I think what we're all about here, and what Studs was all about certainly, was a question of caring. The Spanish had a saying that the left is the side of the heart, and the right is the side of the spleen. And I think it's a very apt saying. The one thing about the list of people who've spoken here at Cooper Union, and I would, just as an aside, it was such a long list of presidents and labor leaders and African American and women's lib revolutionaries have spoken here down through the decades that if it hasn't already been done, I would like to hear and now dub Cooper Union a seedbed of democracy in America. You know, a half century ago, we used to be a lot smarter than people are today. For example, that was, of course, before Fox News and a lot of other things, you know, got on the air. But, for example, we used to say that the Republican Party is not exactly anti-black, it just doesn't care about people. And this question of Fox News and again, a tsunami of misinformation and dissonance that the kept media have been dunning into our ears, I think is precluded. You know, a little more than half of us voted for Barack Obama and a new America. And so we have almost half of our brothers and sisters to worry about, you know, what's wrong with them and what can be done about it. And it's a question of obfuscation and diversion, and to an extent that I think they're precluded from thinking clearly. Not only not thinking clearly, but above all, not thinking critically. You know, as Einstein, you know, I have to take it from me, Einstein said that if our institutions don't inculcate the critical faculty, you know, all is going to be lost. So I think we need to address ourselves to the matter of learning how to distinguish between information and misinformation and real goats from scapegoats.
I would say, Stetson, if you and Studs Terkel both were touched by the WPA, we could do with another one. What do you think? Thank you so much.
So once again, I'll conclude on the note that, you know, to me, this thing, the outpouring and the coming together prove that the American dream was not just a pipe dream. It's the first time we've had concrete proof that we're not going to go in other directions. And I think, and we owe it to Studs Terkel just as much as to any other American on the map. There's no other one before Studs who was responsible for helping to bring that about. And it's so good that he lived to see it.
Thank you, Stetson. Thank you.
I just want to say one thing. Studs would talk to me sometimes about an event, and I'd say, how'd it go? And he'd say, pretty good. I got a standing O. So I hope before we all leave, we can stand up and give himself a standing O.
May I tell him just one anecdote?
Really?
Stetson Kennedy, everybody. Thank you. Thank you for all your work. Next up, author, historian, playwright Howard Zinn.
Well, I first met Studs in 1964. I had just finished 7 years of living in the South and had just written a book called The Southern Mystique, and so he was interviewing me for that. And I had the same experience that has been described by Gary Young and Andre Schiffer, and that is there he was with his book marked all over. I'd never had an interviewer like that. Most of the interviewers I'd had hadn't read any book at all. I mean, not only not mine book, any book. So, in fact, a few years later, he came to Boston, and several of us went to meet him, and he looked at me and said, "The Southern Mystique," and then started quoting from it, which I couldn't have done. But he was amazing. But actually, the thing I remember most about the interview was that afterwards I went back to my hotel room, and I got a call. "Studs." He says, "Are you busy tonight?" I said, "No." He said, "Well, Ida and I have tickets to the Pete Seeger concert. Will you come with us?" So I did. Anyway, that was Studs. So we're all grateful to him, of course, for doing this amazing job of bringing human beings back onto the pages of history. The pages have been cluttered with the pronouncement of presidents, and having read a fair amount of history, I know what's on the pages of history. Cluttered with the pronouncements of presidents and the exploits of military heroes, and Studs, brought people back onto those pages, and people with feelings, people brought their anguish, their joys. When you pick up the traditional Orthodox history book, there are no feelings in those books, everything but. So Studs did an amazing job. Because he was always concerned with what he called the et cetera of history, the people left out. He liked to quote Bertolt Brecht because Brecht was intensely aware of how workers were left out of the stories, of the great achievements of history, and he would like to quote Brecht, and who built the 7 gates of Thebes? When the Great Wall of China was built, where did the Masons go for lunch? And those are the things Studs was interested in. He had a complex understanding of the world. He saw the double nature of things. He saw the double nature of work. When he introduced his book, Working, he says, to write about work is to write about violence. Violence to the body and violence to the spirit. But also, there's something else, something besides the daily humiliations that go with work. There's also somewhere in there a striving for something better. Studs said that the central event of his life was the Depression, and of course you can see that in his writings. You can see that in the compassion in his writings. That always in his head were the pictures of the Depression and his own experiences. And then, of course, there was the war and the blacklist. And he wrote this book, The Good War, with quotation marks around it, which I noticed some writer in the New York Times didn't like. That is, didn't like the quotation marks. And I was always referring to the quotation marks around the Good War. And because I was in the war, and I was in what I considered the Good War, and then when I came out of it, I began to think for myself. When I began to think for myself, I realized that there had to be quotation marks around it. It was not until I read Studs' memoir, Touch and Go, that I discovered that his wife, Ida, is the one who suggested he put quotation marks around the Good War. I think of, what is his legacy to us? What can we learn from him? How can we be better people? Well, one of the things he learned from him is this sort of incurable optimism, not an optimism based on the idea that, everything is going to be okay, An optimism based on the fact that he believed that human beings are essentially good. Maybe not all human beings, but enough human beings to change the world. And that's all we want, that little modest aim. He seemed to have this, I spoke about it, this complicated view of the world, is seeing two sides, and he acted out these two sides in that that is the seriousness and the humor. He did not allow his intense awareness of the tragedies in the world to stand in the way of his having fun. And I think this is an important thing to remember. I mean, the FBI would visit him, and he would have fun with the FBI. They did not have fun with him. It seems that a sense of humor is not a requirement when you join the FBI. So I think that, you know, as we struggle to remove from power the makers of war and the purveyors of greed, we should learn from Stud, you know, and enjoy ourselves. The FBI men were baffled. Let's keep all those people baffled. Yeah.
Howard Zinn. Next up, you can get more information about everybody who's speaking and all the participants after the program. There are flyers at the back. You can subscribe to important magazines and make contributions to important publishing houses and support independent media that deliver people to each other, not just people to advertisers. Next up, I want you to welcome Walter Mosley, author of the Easy Rawlins series and Life Out of Context from Nation Books.
Hello, everyone. You know, I was asked to come to speak here, and you know, and I really love Studs, and so I mean, I couldn't possibly say no. And on the other hand, I felt like I couldn't possibly say yes. I did say yes, but I didn't. The whole time I was thinking, well, maybe I just won't go. I mean, there's a lot of people on the stage. You know, you could have lived without me, and I figured, you know, I could have got sick or something. And it wasn't until this morning that I finally decided that I could come. And the problem, I mean, there's a few problems trying to talk about Studs Terkel. The first one, I think, is kind of concretized by a short lyric by Leonard Cohen from a song, Tonight Will Be Fine. And the lyric goes, sometimes I find I get to thinking of the past when we swore to each other that our love would last. You kept right on loving, I went on a fast. Now I am too thin, and your love is too vast. The thought of Studs, I think of Studs as this giant thing in my life, and not just him. I mean, because, you know, as you get older, people start to echo with other people. I like the word pedestrian. It is who we are at base. Those people passing by in the street, outside the subway window, on our way to work, to home, to someplace ordinary and mundane, and yet at the same time, the place is exotic and extraordinary because life is a kind of inexplicable magic. Some of us, very few I fear, understand the wonder of ordinary life and everyday survival. Studs Terkel was certainly one of those special few. The last time I saw Studs in Chicago, he was in his 90s or just about, and we were being driven somewhere, and Studs remembered that he had an appointment in the opposite direction. And he said, let me out here, Bill. There was a man driving the car. I see a bus coming. And he jumped out of the car, kind of like a little spider, you know, and he jumped over and the bus came and he jumped on the bus. He was 90, you know, and I'm thinking, a bus, you know, and I was amazed. I was amazed. I've seen Stetson, but not in Chicago. It reminded me of my cousin Dave Klieger, who was a Russian Jew, much older than Studs, but I mean, he was born a long time before him, and he was, he was a communist under the czars and a Jew in the Communist Party. It wasn't good for him. So he left, he came to America. But he still loved being a communist. He didn't abandon communism just because it, in some ways, abandoned him. And so he went back in the 60s when he was 72 years old, and he spent a week there, and he came back, and my cousin Johnny and I were visiting him, and we were young, we were 15, 16 years old, and Dave, of course, is 72 years old, and he looked at us and he said, I went to the opera, and I told them who I was, and they gave me the Tsar's seat, the Tsar's seat. And he says, and people were dressed normal, like you and me. And I remember that many years later when I talked to Studs, because the most astounding thing to me about Studs was it was always just you and me. There was never any hierarchy. There was never any difference. You were never above Studs. He was never above you. He would not allow that to happen in his life. And it was such a learning experience. That vastness, of course, is, when I was 18, his book Hard Times came out, and I read Hard Times, but it was a vast book. It was the mind that imagined it was much larger than mine, and still is. And I was just amazed by that. And this is, of course, I don't know him yet. I met him, I forget, maybe in 95, but in 98, he interviewed me. And this morning, I listened to that interview, on the computer, and I was struck by a few things. The first was how often I was silenced by his simple and deep understanding of the world that my book attempted to embrace. Secondly, how he knew the book better than I did. No joke. I mean, he was correcting me. I said, well, that's when he put the cake. He said, no, it was chocolates. It was chocolates. He put chocolates. I said, oh, yeah, chocolates, the chocolates. And third, how he ran over in the interview. The interview is supposed to be a half an hour. Here's a rule, so a 25-minute interview, a half an hour, thing's going to happen. Well, he did 48 minutes. I understood that today because they had to play it over 2 weeks. Because Studs had he knew where he was going. He knew where he was going in the conversation. And the time limit that existed somewhere out there in the world, that was out there in the world somewhere. He says, that's okay, we'll do 25 minutes a day. Next week we'll do another 14 minutes. That interview was more to me like a lecture in which the headmaster, Studs, was allowing me a deeper understanding of myself, my work, and the world that spawned both me and my work. Haki Marabuti, who runs the Black Writers Conference at Chicago State University, has a thing called the African American Literary Hall of Fame. Studs is the only white person in the African American Literary Hall of Fame. I thought that was true, but this morning I called Haki. I said, is that true? He said, Studs is great. And Haki is a guy, he says, really, at one point he said he had a meeting with these people in 1967. He said, that was the last time I talked to any white people for 30 years. He said to me this morning, he said, Studs was a great man. And, and he was very happy I was coming here, and he wanted me to, just to mention him, in connection with Studs. He said, I saw him a few weeks before he died. I kept in touch with Studs. And a lot of people, it's interesting. Studs is kind of confusing in a way. The first time I met him, he took me into a room in which he had all of the tapes of all of the interviews that he ever did. Thousands and thousands of tapes of these interviews. And even though he did talk to, mostly to just normal everyday people, he was very proud of some of the people he talked to who we all know. From my point of view, thinking about things, Martin Luther King Jr., James Baldwin, Muhammad Ali, Mahalia Jackson, Louis Armstrong, Gwendolyn Brooks, Dick Gregory, Ralph Ellison. But for me, the most important thing about Studs is a story he told me in that interview. He told me before, but he also said it in the interview that we had in '98. He was at his house, and he was sitting in the dark, and a burglar broke in his house. And he explained the burglar. He said, this is the first thing he said, he was a good-looking, well-built young man. He came into the house, being a burglar, of course, expecting it to be empty. And when he turned out the lights, he saw me sitting there, and then turned the lights back off to hide his face. Studs was 86 at the time. He said that the burglar was more scared than he was, and they came to an understanding. And Studs reached into his pocket, and he took out his money, and he gave the burglar his money. But before the guy left, he said, "But you know, you're leaving me flat broke. I don't have any money left." And the burglar gave him $20 back. Studs Terkel.
A man who listens and in many ways carries the tradition of Studs Terkel, longtime columnist, reporter, Jimmy Breslin.
Thank you very much. I'm flattered to be here. I'm in Chicago one day. I had something to do, and I met Mike Royko, who was the columnist there, and he was meeting Terkel, as they did an awful lot of times. So Terkel walks in and sits down at the bar like an exposed wire, and the nerves, drink here, talk there, cackle, talk. And then he said he had a great treat for us. He brought in Eric Nesterenko. He was with the Chicago Blackhawks hockey team. He was a licensed gorilla in that business. Hit people with a stick was his best move. Terkel is bringing him back as a poet. So we sit at the bar, and Nesterenko gets up. It's Ricardo's bar, hard by the Chicago Tribune newspaper and the Sun-Times, and he begins to emote. And it was terrible. It was painful, I want to tell you. And, here's this big gorilla, and what are you going to tell him? You're lousy? I don't know what. And Studs was elated. He says, "Isn't he wonderful?" And that was Studs. He loved all of life so much. And he had the guy beaming, and then he finished it, at which he looked for opinions. Mike Royko said, "Eric, don't ever let that son of a bitchin' stick out of your hands." That was one other time we're at the same place, and he comes in, Studs, and we're having a couple of drinks, and that Allende woman from where Chile was in town, and the word fleece came upon our minds when she had spent a lot of time with Studs, and not just for being interviewed on the radio. I think she read a bestseller list that week. At any rate, Mike finally says, "What did you give that woman?" He said, No, it's all right, we'll have a drink. Studs, "What did you give the woman?" "No, nothing, doesn't matter. What does it matter?" So I said, "Well, why don't you tell him so at least we'll know?" "It doesn't matter. 50,000, what does it matter?" We fainted. She beat him out of $50,000. That was for the cause. Whatever the cause was, it wasn't ours. And the bartender either. But that was, he was the last time I spoke to him, it was hard to, I went to see him in the hospital out there, and then he's home, and to talk to him, he had someone, what you did, you called, and someone answered the phone, and you talked to him, then he turned and ran in and told Studs, and you heard this yelling back, and then the guy would get back on the phone and tell me what he said. The subject was one on which I found interesting. I'd been looking things up, that the United States hadn't been in a war, hadn't sent any place troops after anybody who wasn't non-white. We haven't fired at a white since 1945. And it just came to mind with why we were talking was that, you're trying to put a black in the White House at the same time as our national policy has been when we go to the most sacred thing, a war, we only want to fight and shoot at blacks. So I thought it was, something to talk, but it was very hard because you tell the guy on the phone, we shot a lot in Iraq. What would you call them? Duskies, ass studs, what they are. So I'd hear this yelling back, yeah, that's all right, or something. Then I'd ask him the colors of each place where the fights were, and he would answer it. And that's the last I spoke to him, and he was spirited and yelling, but it was yeah, you liked it. When you catch them, yeah, they shot at another black. It was part of him. It was good. But that's gone now, and he's a loss to the hours in which you ever saw him. The energy was beautiful. I mean, it was a knockout. He'd come in at the bar and he would start all over the place. And he would tire people out. I liked him best at national political conventions. He'd get in a place, there'd be 6 or 7 people around him from some delegation from South Dakota, and he'd start talking to them and have them they'd be a nervous wreck at the end of a half hour. You get some Swede from up there coming in from the fields where he'd been, and he mopes into the bar, and he runs into Studs Terkel, and he don't know what hits him. And it was great. He could make you laugh. He loved laughter, and he had charm, and he happened to be brilliant and a terrible loss. Thank you.